I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. We begin with a question: are fines just desserts or beating a dead horse? The answer may be more confusing than you think. We'll discuss it with Philip B. Corbett, the assistant managing editor for Standards of the Times, in just a moment. New York Times journalists Shane Goldmacher and J. David Goodman managed to antagonize both Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio with laser-like precision the other day. Their article on the feud between the two men, David Goodman will explain. My Times colleagues join me to discuss the most intriguing issues of the week on the backstory, and I'll offer some additional thought on Coda. But first, New York Times Standards editor Phil Corbett. Sometimes, Phil, I think I get second-guessed on stories from lots of assistant English professors all over the country, but I'm sure it's nothing compared to what you go through as standards editor. How do we decide what standards are, particularly in a world that is moving as quickly as this one, a world that standards are changing between print and digital? Who sets the standards at the Times?
Well, it's a really good question, and it's a hard one to keep up with. In my job as standards editor, of course, as you know, I deal with all kinds of journalistic questions about our ethics rules, about use of sources and so forth. But one of the big things I deal with is questions of language. I oversee the style book for the newsroom, and so I've become sort of the de facto language arbiter. And what I've definitely learned in my years doing that is Times readers care very deeply about the language we use, and we hear from them quite a bit. And it's a real challenge. On the one hand, we want to maintain a fairly traditional tone in our news coverage, but the world is changing very fast. Reader expectations are changing very fast, and I think trying to write for, say, very long-time traditional Times print readers at the same time that we're also trying to write for much younger readers who might be reading us on their mobile phones, it's a real challenge.
And reading the two, and I'm not sure how many people do, they seem to be two different standards on the web and in print.
I wouldn't say that there are different standards between the web and print, but I think that a few things have happened. First of all, I think we've become more flexible in recent years and more willing to make exceptions to maybe our more traditional rules and adopt a tone or a style that's appropriate to the subject matter.
More vernacular, more colloquial.
Vernacular, we use more first person than we used to, and I think we're more flexible about trying to change the tone and the language we use depending on the topic. So if you're reading a styles piece about some new trend, it's not going to have exactly the same tone or the same style of language as a front page story from the Washington Bureau.
What about vulgarities, obscenities? Obviously, they're moving into the public realm a lot more than they did. We never quoted them before, or also alluded them to as barnyard epithets or some other euphemism.
Right.
What about today?
That's a great question. I would say that Times, has a long-standing reputation, maybe a little bit of an exaggerated reputation of being maybe stodgy, a little Victorian or prudish when it comes to our use of vulgarities or that kind of language. As I say, I think that reputation has always been a little exaggerated, but certainly in recent years, we've become more willing to consider exceptions to those restrictions. But still, we want to maintain a certain tone. We think that readers expect the Times to be serious. We want a tone that's sort of restrained and civil, I guess I would say. So we keep the bar pretty high for vulgarities. If you wanted to, every sports story we write, or for that matter, most of the political stories we write where we quote people, we could quote them using vulgarities and obscenities. But we don't want to use that kind of casual use of language like that. when we do make exceptions, we want to think about it, and it should be in a situation where the language being used is really sort of central to the news story, either because of the position of the person who's being quoted, the situation, or whether the language they used was really key to understanding the news story. In those cases, we don't want a situation where a reader has to read the Times story and then say, I wonder what he really said, and then they have to go and Google or look at some other news source to find out. If it's really key to know exactly what was said, we want to be willing to make those exceptions.
In my reading of the paper and on nytimes.com, it seems that what we often do is include that word or that phrase in the text, but not in the headline, and we will include it if the president or someone of that nature says it, or if Bill Cosby says it in the courtroom, for instance.
Yes, that example about Bill Cosby came up just today. In fact, just shortly before I came over here to the studio, the verdict came down in his case of sexual abuse, and he had an outburst in the courtroom where he used a vulgarity directly at the prosecutor. Pretty shocking. Given who was involved and the setting and the situation. So we pretty quickly decided that that was newsworthy, and we used it. I won't repeat it here in case your audience is restrained like our Times readers.
Or I might get offended. Phil, just tell me quickly, what about just desserts?
Just desserts. So this question came up, and it's really a good example of how much our Times readers do care about the language. We had a column at the end of last week that was about the big fines that had been imposed on Wells Fargo. And the question was the punishment too much, or was it what the bank had coming to them? And the question was posed in the headline about whether this was giving Wells Fargo its just desserts. And almost immediately when that headline appeared online, and then continuing when it appeared the next day in print, we heard from readers well over 100 emails just to me and my team saying, oh my goodness, the Times has this horrible typo in your headline. You said just desserts, and you wrote desserts with one S, when of course desserts is spelled with two S's. Well, in fact, this was a time when we were right, and the readers, forgive me, were wrong about this. Most of the time when they point out a mistake we've made, they're right and we're embarrassed.
Don't you hate that? Right?
It never happens to you, but some of your colleagues know what I mean. But in this case, people were used to hearing that expression, just desserts, and in their minds they assumed it was spelled dessert, like the pie that you eat at the end of a meal.
Right.
But in fact, the word in that sense is related to the word deserve. It means you get what you deserve. And so desserts in that sense is spelled with one S.
A quick last question. How long are we going to keep honorifics in the Times? Mr., Ms.?
Yes, the Times is one of the few news organizations, along with, I guess, the Wall Street Journal, that still routinely uses Mr. or Ms. or Mrs. To refer to people, not just important people, but ordinary people too. I tend to like it. I think it's a sign of seriousness and civility. Some of my colleagues, I'll tell you, think it's old-fashioned, outdated, and they would be happy to get rid of the courtesy titles. It's an ongoing debate in the newsroom. We'll see.
Phil Corbett, Associate Managing Editor of the Times for Standards, thanks for being here. And coming up next, New York Times City Hall Bureau reporter J. David Goodman. Welcome back. It's no secret that Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio don't see eye to eye, either physically or politically. Each competes to be the most progressive government official, with no hiding of their disdain for the other. Recently, David Goodman and Metro political correspondent Shane Goldmacher examined past and present animuses in the New York Times. David, what was the reaction to the story from the governor and the mayor? Did either of them reach out to you or Shane and say, hey, you got me all right or all wrong?
No, it was interesting, actually. There was almost complete radio silence from both camps after the story ran, and I think for each of them, they saw something in it that represented their view, and that sort of took down the other one. And I think we've seen, this feud has been going on now for, you could put the date at different times, but at least, since the late 2014, early 2015. And it continues in part, some people told us, because there's political advantage in it for both of them. And so, they knew the story was coming. Both declined to be interviewed on the record about it, had their surrogates sort of talk about the various points at which they believed they'd been wronged, or the other side had wronged them. And ultimately they believed that it represented something real in their relationship.
It was a very revealing article about their personalities, about some of the impact it's had on both of them. But what kind of impact actually has it had on the city? Well,
it's had a very deleterious impact, I think you could say, on the city. I mean, you see, and increasingly so. I mean, the governor has more and more come out with sort of punitive measures in terms of forcing from the city hundreds of millions of dollars in spending on housing. On the subways, you could argue that this is a crisis that was years in the making, but that you didn't have municipal and statewide leadership come together because they can't get along on even whether or not to euthanize a deer in Harlem. And so on something as major as the subways, I think people look at the two of them and see this as one of the more ridiculous sort of political bouts of macho. I mean, it really does seem like they're trying to sort of outman each other, and meanwhile, strap hangers are sort of left without transit that works.
So the city has been hurt by this because of the mayor's pride or the governor's retribution, in effect.
That's right. I mean, I think it's a little of both. I mean, I think if you read the story, you get a sense that, over time, it was really in the governor's wheelhouse to correct this problem, that really the governor has the power. And the mayor's people were willing to make that point on the record to us, that this is the dynamic in this state and in every state, is that ultimately the state is the constitutional entity and has the power to dictate things to the city. The city can't do it in reverse, and so the mayor has to occasionally pull his punches, and when he hasn't, he's been punished for it. And we see this dynamic sort of in hyperdrive now, that we have Cynthia Nixon running a sort of left flank challenge to the governor, and coming out of the world of supporters of the mayor, and having aides that once ran the mayor's campaign. Governor blames him directly for her, and so that's caused all these dynamics to just kind of explode.
What's the mayor going to do in that race?
Well, he hasn't said, and he hasn't. I asked him directly whether he would sit it out. He hasn't said that. He keeps saying he's not ready to sort of make a decision on it. I think it's a very critical and almost existential question for him, because on the one hand, he's staked out a position where he supports what he calls the ascendant wing of the Democratic Party, the progressives. And he's really put Cuomo in that other box of what they are terming now descendant Democrats. And so if he's in that box, he can't very well then come out and endorse him. On the other hand, it looks very unlikely that that Nixon is going to win, and therefore the mayor will be stuck with Andrew Cuomo for another term, and that's going to make it even worse for him if he comes out for her and she loses. Antagonizing
him even further.
That's right.
Is there anybody around who talks to both of them, who could somehow say, hey guys, let's go out for a drink and let's try to settle this?
Those are two separate questions. There are people that talk to both of them, and there are no people that believe they can get them all together. I mean, there have been people over time who have tried to solve it. Consultant and sort of former political world, member of City Hall, Ken Sunshine, who once tried to bring them together in 2015. You have people like the Partnership for New York City and some of the wealthier members of the city elite who have tried to sort of talk to them and can bridge that gap. But really, this has become so personal that everyone's sort of throwing up their hands, including the mayor, and people have sort of, they're entrenched in this for right now.
Mayors and governors have never gotten along. Is this worse?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I talked to Sid Davidoff, who had worked with the Lindsay administration, remains a lobbyist, and one of the things that he said is that, yeah, sure, they hated each other back in the day, Rockefeller and Lindsay, but they didn't do it in public. And this is, it's part of our age. Everything, that used to be done behind closed doors is done in public at the local and national level. But here you really have a fight that is very much entrenched it's systematic in terms of how the government works in New York City, the state, between the city and the state. But you have these guys fighting in public and doing it so repeatedly, it seems like nothing that anybody's ever seen.
David, very quickly, let me ask you about sexual harassment. What did the mayor have in mind the other day when he talked about it in terms of the Board of Education, the Education Department?
Well, so the mayor was asked about this, the number of complaints. They put out numbers last week late on a Friday, and there were many more complaints at the Department of Education than at other city agencies. And the mayor was asked about, and far fewer of them were actually substantiated by the agency. So the mayor was asked, well, why is that? And he had a very roundabout explanation in which he described it as a hyper-complaint dynamic within the education department. Essentially said you have a culture over there in that agency in which people complain a lot about all sorts of things. And then we asked, well, are you saying about sex harassment as well, which is very at odds with the Me Too message of, people that are brave enough to come forward should be believed. So he got kind of tripped up, and then he walked it back a little bit. He was forced to put out a tweet that said, no, I didn't mean that. But I think he was sincere that there's a culture at the DOE, and our reporting has sort of borne that out. And we mentioned in an article today that this, there is some truth to the idea that there are more complaints there for structural reasons and cultural reasons at the DOE. But to link that to sexual harassment is politically tone deaf and didn't go over well for him.
Like many things he says. Thanks to J. David Goodman for joining us. Look for his and other members of the City Hall Bureau team's articles in print and, of course, at nytimes.com. More Times colleagues join me in a moment with the backstory. Welcome back. What kind of week has it been? President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump hosted their first state dinner for the President of France and his wife. Only one Democrat invited. Trump is now calling the President of North Korea very trustworthy, a reversal from those Little Rocket Man days. And his nominee for the head of Veterans Affairs, now a veteran of the vetting process himself. Joining me to discuss these stories and more, my Times colleagues, contributing writers Clyde Haberman and Eleanor Randolph, and Metro Transportation reporter Emma Fitzsimmons. Welcome back, Emma. You reported this past week that the East Side Access Project, the one that will take the Long Island Railroad to Grand Central directly instead of Penn Station, started out, or last was estimated to cost about $2.2 billion and be finished in 2009. And where is it now?
We're over $11 billion, and it won't be finished until 2022. So we all sort of knew that the costs were escalating, but the MTA came out this week and said, yes, we're up to $11.3 billion. We're disappointed, as you are, about the cost overruns, but we hope it will open in a few years.
Let me ask you one question. Why?
That's right. That's a question a lot of people are asking this week, and MTA Chair Joe Lhota came out and said the benefits outweigh the costs. People are going to be able to get to the east side from Long Island, and we'll have a second rail link. He compared it to Gateway and said, right now we're trying to build Gateway on the Hudson River side, and this will provide a second rail link on the East River. So, which is sort of a changing explanation for the cause of the project. But as many as 200,000 people could use it, they say, and those are people who are trying to get to the east side.
I thought the benefits were mostly supposed to be for Al D'Amato's neighbors.
Mostly. It's a boondoggle. I mean, with all respect to Lhota, this is a total boondoggle. It's not at all comparable to Gateway, which is absolutely essential to the economic health of the entire Northeast, not just New York. And this is a pattern that we see on so many projects. Any estimate that you ever hear from a government official about a public works project is going to cost X billion dollars, multiply it by 2 or 3 times, and have the completion date at least 5 years after. At least 5 years.
And again, this is a state idea by former Senator D'Amato and Governor Pataki that was imposed on the MTA. As I recall it, nobody there said, whoa, let's build an East Side Access project.
But so many of those projects are prompted by an elected official, not by real transit need.
But one of the things that fascinated me in your piece was the difference in the amount, the cost of a mile in the United States, especially in New York, versus Europe. You're talking about, what, $3.5 billion a mile for this subway versus $500 million everywhere else. And that gets back to Sam's question. You want to know why. Why is this so expensive? Why?
Yeah, I mean, we know labor costs are higher, cost of living is higher, things like that, but that big a gap is just incredible.
And there's feather bedding, and there's just raw corruption, and contractors who are allowed to write all sorts of things off.
Do you know that? I mean,
yeah, I think we do. And if it's not corruption in the sense necessarily of payoffs, it's corruption in the sense of people just simply allowing contracts to slide by without any kind of critical analysis.
My colleague Brian Rosenthal did a really great investigation of this at the end of last year. He went to Paris and saw one of the lines they were building at much cheaper. And the piece is really good. It goes over some of the rules at the work sites, and the costs here are just exorbitant.
And again, do we know what makes them so exorbitant?
Brian's piece really delves into it, but it is in part the unions, the worker rules, but even that doesn't sort of explain all of the sort of padded contracts and the soft costs for real estate, and the list just sort of goes on and on.
So that doesn't bode well for improving the city subway system, does it?
Right, and the subway's on everyone's mind, front and center, and so you could have, East Side Access has gone up another $1 billion. That's $1 billion you could have put into the subway, and they are trying to do the rescue plan right now for the subway, but they don't have a lot of credibility right now.
I'll say. Eleanor and Clyde, tell us about the special elections this week for the state legislature and the role of hijacker Simcha Felder.
Good way to put it.
I'll let Clyde talk about Simcha, but what happened really was there were 11 races, and basically there was only one race that would have made a difference, and that was in Westchester, where two very good female candidates were running against each other. The Democrat won. It made it so that if Simcha Felder would, who says he's a Democrat, but he actually has all lines on a ballot, he has said he's working with the Republicans, and because they're 32 and it's 31, and so it's it's a seesaw at this point. If Simcha Felder would go back to the Democrats, where he says he belongs, the Democrats would have a majority. And Cuomo has sent him a letter. And what's interesting in that letter is he says to him, right now you have the best leverage over your fellow Democrats that you will have. Because, Cuomo is expecting that in November, more Democrats will win in the state Senate, and then Simcha will not have this position of power.
So right now you have the greatest leverage, so...
Right, use it, but use it on the Democratic side. Simcha Felder always reminds me of what was famously said about a politician in Washington, that he has all the characteristics of a dog except loyalty.
I think that's not fair to dogs.
Arguably. He has every right to, hijack. He doesn't have a right to hijack, but he has every right to fight for what he thinks is best for
his constituents.
He also claims for all New Yorkers. I would argue that those two don't necessarily go together. But he has jumped from position to position, ignoring what was left behind. He was elected to the city council at one point, and then between November and January, he took a higher paying job with the city controller's office, and then he left that to go run. So there's a reason why I'm reminded of that description of a Washington politician.
Emma, speaking of things that come and go, whatever happened to the mayor's plan for a trolley between Brooklyn and Queens?
Well, we were just hearing from my colleague David Goodman that there's no money for it in the budget, which isn't that surprising. It seems like he's trying to shelve this idea. He still maintains publicly that it's that it's happening, but there's really been not much going on in terms of planning, and even if they do move forward on it, there's not much hope that they would actually have shovels in the ground by the time he leaves office.
Well, does that mean he's admitting it wasn't a good idea, or there just isn't enough money to pay for it right now?
I think both the funding model, they're not sure that it could pay for itself, and at the same time, you have to fight a lot of people to build this trolley. You're going to have to get rid of parking spots. You're going to have to tear up big chunks of Brooklyn and Queens, and I just don't think he has the appetite to wage that battle.
Thanks to my Times colleagues, Clyde Haberman, Eleanor Randolph, Emma Fitzsimmons, for joining me, and I'll have some additional thoughts coming up on Coda. New York has had its share of racially motivated murders, but lynchings here have been an anomaly. At one point, the NAACP recorded 3 between the 1890s and 1930s. That's a number that pales in comparison with the more than 4,000 cataloged in the South by the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which opened this week in Montgomery, Alabama. White New Yorkers were guilty of deadly vigilantism against blacks during the Civil War draft riots, of course, and many fled the city for good. But if you define lynching strictly as mob violence against an inmate convicted or suspected of a crime, more miscarriages of justice in New York have occurred in the courtroom. After the Civil War, hanging and burning blacks summarily became a public spectacle in the South. Few Northerners intervened. When he challenged President Grant for re-election, Governor Horatio Seymour of New York described blacks as an ignorant and degraded race. In the 1890s, Ida B. Tarbell, a black journalist, fled mobs in the South to sound the alarm in New York and abroad. Her hell-raising prompted the Times to describe her as a mulatrous missionary who was spinning, quote, tales of atrocities. But by the early 20th century, 10,000 African Americans, women and children in white, men in black, were marching down Fifth Avenue silently to denounce what the Times called the lawless treatment of their fellow blacks. The march was described as one of the first civil rights protests in America. A full-page ad placed in the Times by the NAACP was headlined, "The Shame of America. Do you know that the United States is the only land on earth where human beings are burned at the stake?" In 1919, the National Conference on Lynching convened in New York to lobby for a federal anti-lynching bill. It passed in the House of Representatives, but it died in the Senate. Every time a black was murdered somewhere by a mob, the NAACP would fly a flag from its lower Fifth Avenue headquarters. The inscription read, "A man was lynched yesterday." The flag was lowered for the last time in 1938 when the landlord threatened the civil rights group with eviction. Around the same time, though, the New York legislature belatedly adopted its own anti-lynching bill. And Abel Meeropol, an English teacher at DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, wrote an enduring poem that would finally sear the nation's conscience. It started this way. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.